What happens when one man tries to watch all the horror films of the 1980s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host, Josh Spiegel, and this is the 80s Project. Here we are. We've reached the ending of 1981 at long last. This has been like a great year for horror, but it just gets better from here. But let's check out to see how this one ends up and also check out the year in review. We begin this round on November 27th, getting really close to the ending of the year here with the release of Just Before Dawn. It kicks off with a couple of hunters, including Mel from Sleepaway Camp, getting killed off by a big burly dude with a machete that makes pig noises. To clarify, the burly dude makes pig noises, not the machete. We then have that classic van full of young folk on a trip together, including Star-Lord's grandpa and the guy who stole Pee-wee's bike. But there's also a nearby forest ranger, Ed Hawken, who tries to warn them away from the area. But you know that they just don't listen. There's the standard shenanigans with some skinny dipping and campfire fun, but things get creepy when it turns out that there's some local inbreds around. And pretty soon, the violence starts. And this one was directed by Jeff Lieberman, and he has a pretty fun filmography with movies like Squirm and Blue Sunshine. And after this, he did the really weird sci-fi action flick Remote Control, and much later, the sorta infuriating Satan's Little Helper. But he said that he made this one as his sort of nod to Deliverance and wrote the script himself, although there's a few other writers credited as well, so it's clear that there were revisions. And it's interesting because this one often gets labeled as a Texas Chainsaw Massacre ripoff, and that element is definitely there considering it's a van full of kids on a trip getting attacked by a hillbilly clan. But considering the camping setting, it's clear that there's a touch of Friday the 13th here as well. Although Lieberman has expressed frustrations with these comparisons, saying he hadn't even seen Texas Chainsaw, and that it was just his inspiration of the Burt Reynolds rafting flick. One of the things that has become most known in the film is the whistling motif in the music, and the score was the work of Brad Fiedel, one of his earliest films, and he'd go on to do The Terminator a few years later. It was produced on a budget of around $1 million and didn't do that well at the box office, and the reviews were middling at best, but there were some that talked up the really lush scenery and atmosphere of the woods setting. One silly bit is that France apparently picked up on that Deliverance similarity since it was released there as Survivance, and I don't want to reveal it here and spoil it, but I can tell you that it has one of the coolest villain deaths going, and a really underrated badass final girl. All through the film, she's made fun of by her macho boyfriend for her girly ways, but yet in the final act, he's a cowering fool while she takes charge. And I'm going to rate this one as 3.5 tapes. I like this one. It takes some standard things that we've seen a dozen times before and gives them a nice polish and interesting characters. Its horror cultural significance is a 2.5 since it's partially remembered but mainly just in a cult capacity and never really stood out as having an impact and more draws from other sources. But it did have some recognizable faces and enough accolades for the 2.5. Should you watch it? Yeah, you should. It may not be very original, but it is very enjoyable. On that very same day, we get a little nugget that I had never heard of, and it's Frankenstein Highland, which I'm guessing is not the result of a failed 3-hour tour. But instead, these four are involved in a hot air balloon crash, and they're a wacky bunch, and instead of the professor, there's Doc Hadley, played by Robert Clark. And they find a series of caves, and right away, this is a weird sort of throwback because this movie feels like something from the 70s, so it's odd to see this so far into 81 now. I realize that the elements of that decade still linger all through here, but this just sticks out. They find a group of women that get their dressing tips from Sheena, and there's a weird phenomenon where their arms get locked up in pain whenever they discuss any specific location. Like if they say the name of a city or something, they're hit with it. There's also a couple of rowdy pirates on the island, and they take the crew up to a nearby hut where none other than Cameron Mitchell is residing behind bars. He says he got there due to shipwreck, so we have a skipper, I guess, but they also meet a mysterious woman named Sheila Frankenstein, but she says that's her maiden name, and her married name is Sheila Frankenstein von Helsing. So like, what's this about? She says that her great-grandfather was the Dr. Frankenstein, and it's John Carradine, who has some experience with movies with Frankenstein in the title, and now has Drac and Doc Frank covered. He only appears in this film as this floating head and was most likely shot in like an hour or so, but he still gets top billing here. And this was from Jerry Warren, who is most known for wackier movies, with his most noted perhaps being The Wild World of Batwoman, which also starred Catherine Victor. And by the time that he shot this, he was pretty disillusioned with the industry. He hadn't made a movie since the early 70s, and only came out of retirement to do this one because he had heard that horror was marketable again, and wanted to cash in. A few years later, he wanted to make a sequel that he wanted to take a more serious tone with, but died in 1988 before it could happen, and this would be his final film. It sure does take a while in this one for there to be any appearances by the monster himself, but he absolutely shows up in pretty hilarious makeup. And I'm giving this one a 3. It's mostly entertaining with some weirdness and fun, but it's pretty forgettable. Its significance is just a 2 since it's pretty lost in time, and doesn't feature many names, but at least has Kennedy and Mitchell. Should you watch it? Probably. It's worth a watch.
And you were cushioned in my arms.
Me?
Cushioned in my arms.
This next one debuted on November 28th, but only in Japan, since it didn't arrive into the US until a few months later in January of '82. But we're looking at Venom, but this one is missing an Eminem theme song. And instead starts with Dr. Raglan and Dirty Mary, and they plan to kidnap the grandson of General Jack D. Ripper here by going undercover as his nanny, and her lover is a Nosferatu. Little Philip pops into the pet store to pick up a pet snake, but it turns out that there was a terrible mix-up, and instead of the common house snake that he meant to get, he ends up with an extremely venomous black mamba. Like, if he gets bitten by the snake, he'd be dead in a minute or two. But as they attempt to begin the kidnapping, it gets loose and bites Louise several times, getting loose into the vents. Pretty soon, it's a full-on hostage situation with the police outside, and when Louise dies, they force Gramps to use his safari expertise to find the snake. And the behind-the-scenes on this one is a mess, which I guess shouldn't be a surprise considering Klaus Kinski was involved. The projects he worked on tended to be insane, as evidenced by my discussion about Schizoid on the 1980 edition of the project. But the director on this one was meant to be Tobe Hooper. He was hired and worked on the film for a short while, and it's unclear just how much of the footage was handled by him, but after a very brief stint, he quit the project over creative differences. It's possible that part of those were enabled by the difficult working relationship formed between Kinski and Oliver Reed, who didn't get along, constantly egged each other on, causing Klaus to get upset frequently. Kinski himself mentions that the crew would consistently gang up on the director, trying to get him off the project, which seemingly worked. After Hooper left, they brought on director Piers Haggard, who had done a long list of projects, including the final Quatermass project. But he jumped in on short notice and stated that it was a very tense atmosphere, and the only likable actor on the set was the snake. Meanwhile, Kinski took this film instead of taking on the role of Toth in Raiders of the Lost Ark, passing on that one because he said that the script was boring and moronic. Plus, Venom paid him a little bit more. It was a solid budget, but did some mediocre business in theaters, although it did make its money back, but the reviews were mostly fairly negative. And my review isn't that negative because I'm giving it a 3.5. This is a pretty wild flick with some fun performances and hilarious moments. Its significance is lower at a 2.5 since it does have a bunch of known names in it, but the movie itself never made a splash and got lost between the 6 other movies called Venom. Should you watch it? Yes! This next one could have been earlier on the project since it did premiere in West Germany in January of '81, but it had a big festival debut in Italy sometime in November and didn't come out in the US until November of '82, and it's in Semanoid, which was also known as Horror Planet. A voiceover tells us about a distant ice planet where they discovered the ruins of an ancient race that lived there and a bunch of caves. The crew there experiences a mysterious explosion that drives Ricky here insane, and he goes running off, which causes all sorts of problems, including severed limbs and death. Later on, things get even more bizarre when they try to continue their work, only to be attacked by a big creature that kills one and then takes Sandy captive, where she's drugged. And then a large alien appears and Kandarian tree branches her with some sort of tube that, well, I mean, look at the title of the movie. And then, of course, because that's the movie, it turns out that she's pregnant, even though that's not possible. And this is brought to you by Norman J. Warren, the man behind Satan's Slave. And he'd later go on to make Bloody New Year. But he was meant to be doing a flick called Gargoyles that fell through. So instead, he turned to a script that was given him by 2 of his special effects team on a previous movie. They managed to pull together a budget of around $1 million, partially with the help of notorious Hong Kong action film producers, the Shaw Brothers. The original concept took place in space, but they decided that might be a bit too expensive to shoot, so they found a location in a set of caves, figuring it would be cheaper and easier while providing a higher level of production value. Unfortunately, the rock structures down there made the lighting and staging difficult and ended up taking up more time than expected. There was also tension on set as Warren would get into shouting matches with the male lead, Robin Clark, and when it was released, the critics weren't too kind. Many people pointed out its similarities to Alien, what with the claustrophobic setting and the group of space miners that sees one of them get impregnated with an alien, but for the most part, like the plot points are circumstantial. It did do quite well at the box office, although nothing too impressive. Like, its international business was strong, since it was a British film, and got a wider release there first, and picked up another $1.5 million in the US, and became a video store staple. And I give this one a 2.5. It's got a handful of entertaining moments, but the whole middle section is pretty standard derivative stuff. Its significance is the same since it's gotten some attention, but isn't overly well known and didn't really launch many careers. Should you watch it? Maybe. I mean, it's not terrible, but you're not missing a ton if you skip it. This next entry had an unspecified release in Canada during the month of December, but got a wider release in several countries in '82, but didn't get a release in the US until '86 on video, and it's Ghostkeeper, a movie I previously covered on a list of Wendigo-themed films. It has 3 people, a guy and 2 women, out in the mountains on a couple of snowmobiles, even though they're warned to stay off the hills in the conditions. Of course, they should have listened, and things get rough, so they seek out refuge in an abandoned hotel that they find. At first it seems empty, and they relax and settle in for the night, but before long they discover that it's already occupied by a cranky old woman who says that she lives there with her 2 sons. Before long, someone is in there with them, attacking Chrissy and then killing her. The eeriness continues as they search for her, encountering the old woman talking to herself, and the next morning, their snowmobiles have been sabotaged, stranding them there while Jenny finds an old book telling the legend of the Wendigo, a creature from native folklore, and soon comes face to face with one. And this one was directed by Jim Makachuk, and this one has a wild story behind it. This was his very first feature film, the very first thing he directed, and pretty much his first work in the industry whatsoever, although he'd gone to a modest writing career that included Heathcliff the movie. He managed to raise up a budget of around $1 million or a little less, and went in with a big script and extensive use of its creature, the Wendigo. However, after halfway through the shooting, they essentially ran out of money. He was given the option to stop production and walk away from the film, but decided to push forward anyway, throwing away the script and making up the rest of the story as they went along, cutting out most of the appearances of the creature, keeping it as a more understated, making it sort of more fragmented, surreal series of events. Reviews compared the setting to The Shining, but not a whole lot else, although most of the remarks were somewhat favorable. People liked the cast and the atmosphere of the wintry surroundings, but it never received a theatrical run in the States and only got a limited engagement in Canada, so it wasn't really all that successful, but has since developed a nice cult following. And I'm going to give this one a 2.5. There's some good things going on, and I'm a sucker for horror in the snow, but it's a bit too sluggish with not a lot of payoff. Its significance is just a 1.5 though, since it's barely known, really dipping into cult territory, and doesn't really feature any horror names. Should you watch it? Maybe. I mean, it's not a hard watch, and it's a nice slow burn, although it never quite catches fire.
Just once. Just once I would love to see him get real mad, you know, just get unsure of himself.
This next little number arrived in theaters on December 11th, and it's a fun little guy called Dawn of the Mummy. And it kicks us off in ancient Egypt with some villagers being taken away to be slaves. And then the pharaoh is mummified, and they're sealed into his tomb.
After it is sealed, will die on the dawn of the mummy.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a title. It then jumps to present day with some tomb raiders trying to bust in, and an old woman tries to warn them away, but no one listens, and the curse is unleashed. Meanwhile, back in the US, a photographer is sent over there with a couple of models for a top-notch shoot, but have a blowout along the way. Rick and his crew enter the tomb carrying a box of dynamite conveniently marked with a big skull and crossbones, which I imagine that all boxes of dynamite have. The two groups cross paths and enter the tomb, commencing a photo shoot, but the heat from the lights, I guess, awakens the mummy. It rises up and then revives its followers, who in this instance are less mummies and more like zombies. And this was brought to us by Frank Agrama, who also wrote and produced the film, and he had been directing for a while and was Egyptian. Most of his previous works were in Egypt or some low-budget 60s films, but he did make Queen Kong in the 70s, but this would end up being his final directorial work. After this, he shifted entirely into the producing game, and in '83 he founded Harmony Gold, a name that should be familiar to you if you grew up on Robotech, since he was the man responsible for its American importing and conversion. This film was a bit of a standout due to its unique portrayals of the mummies, which, yeah, considering that the crew outside of Agrama were Italian, has been compared to the Italian zombies. So much so that this was released in some territories as Zombie 6, part of the Italian zombie franchise. And they're particularly violent, which of course got the movie into some trouble in the UK, which put it on the nasty list. It wasn't prosecuted, but it was confiscated and not available to view there in the uncut form until the mid-2000s. It has a cult following and was actually remade in 2013 as a sort of Brandon Fraser mummy knockoff called Prisoners of the Sun, which had a script by Peter Atkins and Anthony Hickox, but never really got any attention. And I've got this ranked at a 3. I like it, but mostly for the finale. It takes way too long to get going, but once it does, it rocks. Its significance is just a 2 though, since it's not remembered all that well and doesn't really feature any known faces, but did get some recognition and put on the nasty list. Should you watch it? Yeah, unwrap this one for some fun. Here's one that had an unknown release date in 81, but there's a slight possibility it aired on TV in October of 80, although it's hard to tell. But it's said to have had some theatrical screenings in 81, and it's Rana, the Legend of Shadow Lake. Of course, it's set on a lake where some spooky goings-ons are going down, and there's something under the water. Kelly here had some sort of encounter with a creature when he was a boy and is now determined to find it, and brings his son, who's also named Kelly, and there's talk around town about the local legend of Rana. There's the local kook as Kelly Sr. talks about learning the tale of Rana from Old Man Charlie. And meanwhile, there's a group of treasure hunters who are there pretending to be a bunch of loggers, and everyone sort of encounters the thing in the lake, but like very, very slowly. It does appear to kill folks every once in a while, but this one is by Bill Rebane, and if you're familiar with his other work, you know to expect a pretty damn slow pace. He's been featured on this channel a few times before, most notably with Monster A Go-Go, billed as one of the worst movies of all time. But he's also responsible for The Capture of Bigfoot, which I had on one of the Bigfoot lists, and he's done several other horror flicks as well with the reputation of working on a shoestring budget. And if you're one of my Spanish-speaking viewers, you already know what the deal is with the creature in the lake because Rana means frog, and our creature is essentially a giant frog man, which was utilized a little later on since later releases went all in on the frog stuff and they changed the name to Croaked Frog Monster from Hell and just put a big old frog monster on the cover. And it was distributed by Troma. And what's funny is that if you look at the Wikipedia, it says that Lloyd Kaufman lists this as one of the 5 best Troma movies ever released. But I own that book, and I can tell you that it says the opposite. It's on a list of the 5 worst movies they put out. And Lloyd says that even the frogs were embarrassed to be in it. All said and done, when the thing is finally revealed, it's basically not even a frog, and it's more like a background slee stack. And I don't quite agree with Lloyd because I've seen way worse Troma films, but I'm still only giving this one a 1.5. It has some charm, but mostly just feels like a movie at a time. Like Frankenstein Highland, it has more in common with 70s films than the 80s. Its significance is only a 1 since it's pretty much all but forgotten, doesn't feature any known cast members, and even the effects are dated. Should you watch it? You could leave this shadow in the dark.
Oh, God. Kelly, it's all true. Incredible.
Almost at the end of the year now, and on December 18th, there was possibly the highest profile release in this block, Ghost Story. It has this group of older gentlemen, including the great John Houseman, Fred Astaire, Melvin Douglas, and freaking Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and they hang out and tell each other spooky stories. Dr. Gordon is here too, and he gets a scare and falls out a window, giving us some full frontal at the same time. His twin, Dawn, also played by Craig Wasson, suspects that his bro was murdered, and the club members are all haunted by terrible nightmares. And soon, Edward sees the same phantom that his son did and falls from a bridge. They deem it a suicide, but Dawn doesn't quite believe that and starts his own investigation that seems to point to the Eva Galli house, which is now occupied by a couple of squatters. Dawn needs to talk to the Chowder Society, so he pays their entry fee, telling a ghost story. And it's about himself as a teacher, meeting the Borg Queen, starting a wild romantic fling with her, although it appears as if she holds a dark secret within her, with their relationship ending and her moving on to his brother. All the while, the dark secret of the society starts to unfurl. And this is the work of John Irvin, and his career is all over the place, although he seems to focus on drama and action, but like he did Widow's Peak, A Quaint Tale of an English Widow, and also Arnold Schwarzenegger's Raw Deal. But this looks like one of his few dips into the world of horror. The script was partially written by horror writer Peter Straub and was based on his novel of the same name. And the makeup effects were by industry legend Dick Smith. And the corpse dummy would go on to be featured on an iconic Fangoria cover back when the magazine was brand new. Oddly enough, it would go on to become the final film for 3 of the Chowder Club, with only John Houseman continuing on after this. Both Astaire and Fairbanks retired from film, and Douglas would die shortly before Ghost Story's release. It had a fairly beefy budget, costing $13.5 million, and did quite well at the box office, raking in around $24 million, although the reviews weren't kind, calling it dull and cliched. But it was nominated for a Saturn Award for Best Horror Film, losing out to An American Werewolf in London. One last thing to point out about this is an unused effect that was featured in Dick Smith's effects book that was awesome. It was a creature with no eyes or nose and just this creepy ass mouth. They didn't feature it in the film, but almost 20 years later, the same design was used in the House on Haunted Hill remake. And I'm going with a 3.5 on this one. It's more like a 3.75, I suppose, but I like this a lot. But the story's a bit weak. But every other single thing around that story is awesome. The cast, the atmosphere, the effects, it's all great. But the script itself just never kicks into being great. Its significance is a 3.5 as well, since it's a fairly well-known, has a solid cast, had Dick Smith involved, but never reached a larger success. Should you watch it? Definitely. It's a bit slow, but it's worth it.
Don't you want to make love to me? Don't you want to know what you touched?
This year ends on December 26th in Australia with a little Ozploitation feature called Allisons Birthday. It begins with 16-year-old Allison and her friends playing with the old squeegee board, and Chrissy here is possessed by a spirit claiming to be her dad, who tries to tell her that something terrible will happen before her 19th birthday, before she's crushed. It then jumps ahead, and it's just a few days before her 19th, and she has a fella named Pete, and her aunt convinces her to go home for the occasion, although she's apprehensive about it. She brings Peter along, and at first everything seems normal, but then she's discovered a series of Stonehenge-looking rock formations in the woods out back. Things get wilder when there's an old woman there, her great-grandmother that she's never even heard of before. And it's pretty clear that the family has nefarious things in store for Allison. And sure enough, that's exactly what's up, and cults and rituals are involved, with Pete trying to get her out of the house, and the family fighting him every step of the way as they get closer to Allison's birthday party. And this one was directed by Ian Coughlan, who is very involved in Australian television and had been a writer and director on several long-running series over there, and he wrote this script as well. But oddly enough, it would be the last thing that he directed, and after this point he would stick to writing, eventually tackling a long run on the popular soap Neighbours. And it's kind of weird because the movie seems to play out like some sort of mystery, but it also tells you what's going on nearly right away, so I'm not quite sure what the vibe that they were going for was. And yeah, overall, I'm going to go ahead and give this one a 2. I really want to like it because it's pretty well made, but you kind of know what the end game is for the entire runtime, so there's a point where you're just waiting for the expected finale to happen, and it does. Its significance is just a 1 since it's pretty unheard of and it didn't lead to any careers in horror, and in fact, it seemed to have ended one. Should you watch it? I mean, I'd say it's pretty skippable.
She's coming. Murder's coming.
So there you have it. That closes out this list. So let's check out all of the movies from my top ranked to the bottom. Okay, and just like last year, we're going to end with doing a sort of best of for the movies, an idea that was originated in a series called Horror Movie Superlatives that was done by your friendly neighborhood Uncle Pete and Carlin Cook on their channels. And it's sort of a yearbook style award set up for the movies. For best gore, I mean, this one's pretty easy for me, and it's the Beyond. Like, I realize that it's not the most technically proficient gore, but it's the most abundant. For the best so bad it's good, I'm going to go with another easy answer, and it's The Last Shark. This one is so unintentionally hilarious, it's a Hall of Famer. For the most WTF, I mean, there's a few of them here on this year's list, but none so out there as Mystics in Bali. I mean, like, for the severed head with intestines flying through the air alone, but then with the whole blood of the pregnant woman thing, yeah. For our most unique movie, this might be an unusual pick, but I went with Scanners, since the concept of people who can blow up your head with their mind or fight just by looking at each other is pretty unique. I mean, in terms of the year and horror in general. As for the most overrated, I'm giving this one to The Omen 3, The Final Conflict. I mean, it gets a lot of credit for being a part of a big franchise and having a great Sam Neill performance, but it's a bit of a slog. For the most underrated, I mean, it's gotta be Woofin'. This is an odd, creepy little flick that has a lot to say, and I don't think it's talked about enough. And finally, as the most amazing movie of 1981, it's an easy one here, and my first film to take the perfect score on the project, and it's The Evil Dead. One hell of an amazing movie. So there it is, all of the horror movies of 1981. By the way, my favorite one of this particular block was Ghost Story. But yeah, obviously for the year, it's going to be The Evil Dead. It's going to be my absolute favorite. I want to know what your favorite was. What's your favorite movie from this block and for 1981 in general? Tell me that down below in the comments. Also, please like this video, subscribe to the channel so that you know when we start up the next 80s project, and also go to my Patreon page and help support this project and keep it going for years and years to come. I really would love to get to the ending. Let's get to December of 1989, and then let's move on to the 90s project. But for now, we're moving on to the very next episode, 1982, here on the 80s project.